name is Ben Bradford. I'm from the University College George Ando Institute of Crime Science, and I'm here to interview Mike Hough from Birkbeck College, University of London. Hello, Mike.
Good.
So let's start with your education and early career. I think you were at Oxford, is that right? What did you read?
Yes, I read philosophy and psychology at Oxford, which is my only real academic qualification. I think that the psychology element of it was rather good in giving me a sort of basis of research methodology, but I feel much more attached in a way to the philosophy part of my original course, because that was pretty important for giving analytic skills, I think, conceptual skills.
And what did you do straight after graduating?
Well, straight after graduating, I didn't do a lot. It was in the era when work was regarded as rather a distasteful activity that isn't something you should engage in. But reality caught up with me 3 or 4 years later, and I wondered what I could do, and I thought I might be able to blag a job at the Home Office as a researcher, which is what I did. And I worked for the Home Office Research and Planning Unit for 20 years. And then I jumped ship in 1994 because the Home Office felt like an increasingly difficult place to work in for sort of political reasons. And of course it's got worse since. It's got a much more toxic quality to it now, and I'm glad I don't work there, and I'm glad I work in academia.
Give some examples of the history of that Home Office experience.
When I originally joined the Home Office, the research team was actually highly autonomous and didn't really engage with ministers, hardly engaged with senior policy officials, and we sort of did what we thought was right. And over the 20-year period, ministers got a lot more controlling, and civil servants got a lot more anxious about the sort of things we wrote. And eventually the policy machine took control of the research functions, which was good for them and bad for research, I think.
Yeah. So in 1994 you moved out of the Home Office into academia. How did that go? What's the trajectory there?
Well, I originally wrote a letter to the Vice-Chancellor of South Bank University saying I think I could do well setting up a research centre. And to my astonishment, he said, yes, and you can have a chair. So I left and went to South Bank and was there for about 7 years, and then got a bit frustrated with that as a rather sort of fragile institution, and so moved to King's College London from 2003 to 2010, which was generally a nice, welcoming place to work in, but they made a decision to get rid of criminology, to disinvest in criminology, which was painful, unpleasant. It felt like a betrayal. So I went to another part of the University of London, Birkbeck, as you know, which has been a good home since 2010.
So that's brought us up pretty much to the present day. What are you currently working on?
I'm, well, as you know, finishing off work on the European Social Survey that we've done together. We're pretty much done on that as far as I'm concerned. I've been working on the International Self-Report Delinquency Study, the round 3 of that, and we're pushing out various publications. And I've just done a book with Sébastien Rocher, an edited book, which is very good and really worth buying. And I've been doing work with the College of Policing and the London Mayor's Office on the new graduate entry for police officers, which actually, it sounds quite nerdy, but I think it raises a whole lot of interesting issues about what the goals of professionalisation in the police are. And I'm getting increasingly retired as well.
I think when you first started at the Home Office, there was obviously the crime survey, British crime survey, as was, but you were quite associated with kind of situational crime prevention in its early inception. But what you just said there is that suggests a kind of move away from that aspect of criminology. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I was I was a fellow traveller rather than a true believer in situational crime prevention. And the first 3 or 4 years of my work at the Home Office, I worked with Ron Clark and Pat Mayhew on situational prevention. And I think it made a real contribution, but I think it's a fairly... It's half an answer or a quarter of an answer to crime control. And there are lots of other things that have to be taken into account. But it was nice to do that, but much nicer to be one of the small team developing the British Crime Survey, which was a gift to somebody at the start of their career.
And you're quite well associated with procedural justice theory now. How did you get interested in that?
It's a sort of complicated process of stepping stones. The crime survey started me getting interested in public confidence, public trust, attitudes to sentencing, and attitudes to the police. And we did various reports around that without really making the linkages to procedural justice theory, which was not very visible in the 80s and early 90s. And then I did a largish project with Marion Fitzgerald for the Metropolitan Police, looking back to David Smith's study of police and people in London, which, although I didn't realise it at the time, was basically adopting a procedural justice framework. We looked at the declining trust of Londoners in the police and linked it to quality of police contact, which was declining because of new public management targets. Well, that was our story. And then I discovered, after we published our main report, Tom Tyler's work, and we all got interested in using the European Social Survey to test procedural justice theory across Europe, and as you know,
here we are.
Here we are, yes.
So you've already mentioned the British Crime Survey, as was the Crime Survey of England and Wales. What would you say are your kind of main achievements over the course of your career?
Yes, this is where I boast to try and... I will boast. I think the Crime Survey did very well, and it obviously was because we had resources from the Home Office to do a large-scale survey, but the 3 people who designed the survey were Pat Mayhew at the Home Office, myself, and somebody from what is now Nat Sen called Douglas Wood. And I think we did a pretty reasonable job in getting a robust survey that has been in the field for almost 30 years now. It's obviously not perfect, and some of the judgments we made about design had to be revised a bit, and some were questionable, but basically it worked pretty well. So I have a nice warm feeling about the BCS, the CSEW, still. And then that sort of survey work took me into work on public opinion on sentencing in particular. And Julian Roberts, now at Oxford, and I, as you know, did a lot of work on what people think about sentencing and whether they're informed or not, and how misinformation generates punitivity. And that programme of work found its mark. And then, as I said, that morphed into procedural justice theory. And I think our work particularly on the European Social Survey, has actually had quite a lot of impact in the UK. I mean, I don't know if you'd agree, but I think the College of Policing and the National Audit Office and the Inspectorate of Police all bought into the basic ideas quite solidly. It was interesting that the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice didn't really ever use the terminology of procedural justice. I think it was too difficult, too opaque for politicians to talk about something that sounded all to do with red tape. But the basic ideas have become now a commonplace in policing and in the criminal process.
I agree with that. I mean, you mentioned the dreaded impact word. As you know, all British academics are meant to have impact on policy in the real world now. What would you say is a piece of work that you've done that's had the most impact construed in that way?
I think with no credit to myself, the British Crime Survey, or the Crime Survey for England and Wales, and by the way it's called Crime Survey for England and Wales because it's no longer British, but it started off by being a Scottish, English and Welsh survey, but leave that aside. It's embedded itself in these sort of statistical structures of crime. It's the first reference point in what crime trends are doing, and I think it's really improved our understanding of movement in crime trends a great deal. But in terms of personal impact, I would say first that the procedural justice work has actually got to where we wanted to get to. And the work I did with Julian Roberts also established a sort of orthodoxy about what public opinion, how to think about public opinion in relationship to the courts. And the really important lesson here is that you should always choose colleagues who are smarter than yourself. That's how to get ahead in life.
So you've described your kind of don't say this the wrong way, long career now, both inside the Home Office and in academia, and kind of embedded in British criminology over that period of time. What would you say are the kind of main characteristics of UK criminology, both at the time when you started working in the Home Office, when it was still a discipline in its infancy, really, and what it's like today, and how things have changed over that period of time? That's a big question.
I'm trying to think of the best ways of tackling that. And I've been labelled or even othered, along with ex-Home Office colleagues, as administrative criminologists, which I've always found rather irritating. I think there was a sort of needless gap, a non-productive gap between government research, which was substantially but not entirely quantitative, and academic criminology, which was much less engaged in policy and much more qualitative. And the new deviancy in conference was sort of fairly sceptical about most government research. When I was at the Home Office, we sort of secretly agreed with the NDC people and didn't do so publicly. But when the new realists, criminologists started, or when Jock Young transformed himself and others into new realists, then the Home Office researchers were in competition with the new realists in using quantitative criminology, or particularly crime surveys. And I thought that the Islington Crime Survey and the Merseyside Crime Survey and one or two others were actually rather good, but they had to market their work as distinctively different from and better than the Crime Survey. So throughout the 80s and early 90s, we sort of had spats at each other about how the National Crime Survey was an inadequate tool and how local surveys did it much better. But no, the National does this, so we went to and fro on that. And I think that was a shame that there wasn't much more dialogue between or within criminology to resolve the not very large differences between the NDC people and the radical wing of criminology, if you want, and the people who were in government. What happened after that was that there was quite a diaspora of government researchers, so that many of my ex-Home Office colleagues are now in quite significant positions in mainstream criminology, and that exporting of research skills and of policy savvy has been, I think, quite significant. What's happened since is this does irritate me, and I don't wish to speak ill of the dead, but Jock Young's last book was needlessly critical of quantitative criminologists and people who do research on grants. So he would probably have thought of me as what he called a data saw, somebody who was obsessed with large data and had a small brain and a long tail, and this was a strange attack by an eminent criminologist. It's quite obvious to me that we need large quantitative studies to get at some of the quite subtle factors that drive crime, sitting beside quantitative criminology and complementing each other. And I think we're making good progress on that, but it should have happened earlier. Now I see academic criminology as really quite largely disengaged from policy. The government departments have retreated from academia, and academics have retreated from government. I think American criminology feels much more comfortable in engaging with policy, perhaps because of the federal structure, I don't know. But there aren't many of us who have close-ish links with either the judiciary or with senior cops or with government departments. And I think it's necessarily an applied discipline where to thrive it really needs to be engaged with policy.
Well, why do you... the thing that strikes me from listening to you talk there is there was this kind of effervescence, I think that's quite the right word, of kind of quantitative criminology around the time of the British Crime Survey and the Islington Crime Survey. And then there was a withdrawal from that over the next kind of 20 to 30 years, certainly with an academic criminology, and we're only, in a sense, just getting back to perhaps where we were in the early 80s.
Yes.
So what happened? Why was that?
I think there was, in the 90s, there was a sort of an ideology about research that emanated from the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, about the supremacy of randomized control trials, which argued, of course also from the Maryland scale and so on, saying that the best research is research that is experimental, that gets at effectiveness. And the people arguing that point of view suggested that the best criminology ought to be randomized control trials or the next best thing, which was a huge oversell. And I think it put up the backs of so many people doing good descriptive work, whether quantitative or qualitative, and in particular I think it sort of felt like a threat to qualitative researchers. And it led to the crime reduction program funded by the Home Office from about 1999 to 2003, trying to get at what works. The outcome of that program was actually pretty disappointing. You weren't involved in any of that, but I had £1 million grant to look at burglary reduction across England, looking at police schemes designed to reduce burglary with a quasi-experimental design. There were two other burglary projects on similar scales. So just on one crime category we had £3 million devoted to this programme. And what we all conclusively demonstrated was that many experiments run by the police end up with implementation failure. And in fact, most of the crime reduction programme, like a big sum of money, 60 million in total or something, which was going to crack all the policy issues about finding what works, was an embarrassing demonstration of the difficulty of implementation. I think that experience, the souring of relations between academic research and government because of the ideological preference for RCTs, plus an attempt to introduce experimental research on a large scale that failed, took us through a not very progressive period from the late 90s to the late noughties. Does that cohere with your experience of things?
Yeah.
And now we're in a much more comfortable place where I think anybody would say that the right research method depends on the research question, and you tailor the method to the question rather than tailor the question to the methods you've got to hand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
you can't deny
we're getting there, exactly. I mean, you mentioned a lack of engagement with policymakers as a feature of British criminology, which rings a bell with me. Well, what do you think the other key features of British criminology as an academic discipline? Where does it sit?
One of the things about it is that it sits very comfortably within a struggling university system because of its popularity. So just in terms of teaching, it's still thriving. And I find this really quite surprising because the career trajectories of our people passing through degree courses cannot be primarily into the criminal justice process or into research. They must go somewhere else, and I don't know where they go.
It's a mystery to me.
Although I was, in fact, sold a nice new car by somebody who had just graduated from a criminology course in a South English university. So I know what happened to one person. He gave a very good deal. So there is this paradox of it. It remains a thriving discipline whilst still being rather disengaged from practice. It'd be interesting to see what happens when the requirements for graduate entry to the police actually go fully live, because that will mean that every entry cop will have to have a policing degree, and over time that will expand to include people already in the workforce. And that's quite a large expansion of a very applied teaching process that will be at heart criminological.
Yeah.
So I think that's something to watch with interest.
Yeah. And as moving on to think about Europe, and obviously if I could ask what's the difference between British criminology and European criminology, but that makes no sense whatsoever. So what are the differences between British criminology and particular European criminologies, national or otherwise? Is the British experience similar or different?
It sort of generally feels like we're converging. I mean, historically, British criminology felt pretty close to the Dutch and the Scandinavian criminologists, with the rest of Europe rather unlocked into that process. And over the last 10 years, and it could be to do with European Commission funding, a lot of other countries have become a lot more active in doing the sort of research that I would think of as British. So for example, there was very little French survey work 20 years ago, 30 years ago, almost none. And now there are some very good French quantitative criminologists doing very interesting stuff, as we know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, the obvious point of comparison in criminology is always with the United States. So do you think, I mean, is the UK closer to the States, you know, bond of common language, or would you say the UK is closer to Europe, or?
I think we're now doing rather better than American criminology in integrating theoretical and empirical work. I think you don't have far to look to find empirical work that's genuinely theory testing. Obviously there's plenty of that in the States, but I think it's a central orientation in British criminology and in European criminology. What happens, of course, when Brexit happens remains to be seen. I mean, I've really valued the 2.5 significant European projects under European Commission money. The engagement of 9 and then 12 partners across Europe, I found really nice and stimulating for me, and I hope everybody else benefited. And I'm not sure if I believe the British government's commitment to carry on enabling that sort of collaboration by contributing funds to whatever the Horizon 2020 follow-on is. But it'd be a shame if they didn't. There are so many people in the UK and in Europe who are benefiting from those large-scale collaborations, I think.
Yeah. Let's not think about Brexit too hard. I always think about American criminology being very different to European criminology, and that would include UK. But I would wonder, why do I think that? Is that just a lazy assumption on my part? It seems to me most American criminologists are really doing something quite different to what most British criminologists are doing. Is that?
Expand on what you mean by that.
Well, perhaps I might go back to your point before that American criminology is much more narrowly focused on policy and particularly crime control policy. So most American journals, most American authors tend to be working much more closely on how do we stop crime. And what do we do with people who have offended. Whereas British criminology is in particular, and I guess European criminology as well, is often quite institutionally focused. People are interested in the police or the courts or the probation or whatever it is. There's that.
Perhaps a stronger sociological tradition in Europe than in the States.
Yeah.
It certainly feels to me like the Americans are much more comfortable with a policy-related role than most UK criminologists. I think that's true. But actually the reality is I'm much more engaged with European criminologists now than with Americans. And the only American-based academics that I am regularly in touch with have European origins.
Right. Yeah. I mean, do you see that increasing divergence in the future?
Oh, Lord knows. I don't know. One would hope not. One would hope that there should be a global integration rather than a global fragmentation. It depends where the American political trajectory takes us, of course.
And our own.
Yes.
I mean, one question that occurs to me is we have been talking as if criminology is a discipline. I just used the word discipline of criminology. I mean, do you think it is?
It's a sort of sub-discipline with at least three parents, isn't it? I mean, law, sociology, psychology, and other things. So I don't think it can claim to be a discipline in its own right. And also, I don't think it's especially useful to set up another sub-discipline, crime science, to set aside criminology, because it just goes through a much more crowded field. But it's not an issue I fret about at night, because it's what I do, and I don't mind what label it has when I do it.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that you feel generally close now to European criminologists, perhaps.
Yes, certainly. Yes.
I mean, do you think has your role in the ESC had anything to do with it? Moving the conversation onto that. Talk a bit about your role.
I've always been a consumer of ESC products rather than a producer, I'd say. I went to the first ESC conference in 2001, shortly after it was set up. And I think I've been to something like 11 out of the 17 since. So I've definitely been an ESC conference groupie for a long time. But I've never been formally engaged with ESC structures. My involvement in a sort of cross-Europe criminology has always been from projects like Eurojustice and Fiducia, which were FP7 EU Commission stuff, and FP6 and FP7, wasn't it?
Yeah,
I think
so.
Yes, and as I said, I do hope that sort of funding stream will continue, as that's what cements a decent cross-European criminology.
I mean, we can't get away from Brexit, so I mean, you're probably a bit more tapped into those debates.
Who really want to disengage themselves from European collaboration. I mean, that seems to be the trajectory of the Tory party. and that would make me quite anxious about any commitments for making up the hole in funding created by withdrawal from the European Commission, European Union. On the other hand, there is a sort of little gleam of hope that there will be some parliamentary vote that will kick out the current Brexit options and will lead to another referendum, which might change the landscape, reset the landscape back to a more rational one. But I don't think I really believe that.
No, I don't think I do either. So, moving away from the depression of Brexit, say a bit more about the ESC. I mean, you've been coming since 2001.
Yes.
How has it changed in that time? And what, you know, as someone who's not been involved in the kind of the formal structures of it, how has it helped you perhaps tap into some of these networks or create a thing that there is a European criminology?
I guess the conference is the obvious point of my engagement, and it's usually the networks I have usually used the conference as a meeting point and a point of dissemination. So I wouldn't even say I could rehearse precisely what the different committees, different panels, different working groups are that the society set up, except that it's clearly grown. I mean, I don't know, there are 1,400 people at this conference, something like that. Yeah. And Lausanne was really quite a pocket-sized conference in comparison.
I mean, you touched on this before, and in the British context, the kind of growth as criminology as a discipline, and that's reflected in student numbers in the UK. It's reflected in the growth of the conference we're at today. Why is that? What's happened in the last 15 years?
I guess it's partly that it's a subject that captures the popular imagination, and particularly the imagination of young people, in a way that might lead to disappointment later. But all the television programs about CSI and people doing investigative work that is hugely impactful, which bears very little relation to criminology, may actually be herding people into criminological courses. Slightly more positively, it is actually just a very interesting set of issues that criminology grapples with, and it doesn't need a lot of explaining why somebody might choose that as a degree topic rather than medieval history, for example. Yeah. Although I'm sure medieval historians would be astonished at such a brave claim.
I'm sure that's right. I mean, one of the things that's always struck me is in the world of impact, that it's very easy for criminologists, or relatively easy for criminologists, to have impact in a way that it isn't for other disciplines. And that obviously attracts money, and then you get this kind of snowball. I mean, do you think that's true?
That could be the dark side of the UK funding system that is increasingly rewarding impact. Because yes, we can demonstrate that the work we've done has been picked up by this organisation and that police force, and we have evident sort of evidence trails to impact. And I don't know how a medieval historian starts to demonstrate impact, real-world impact, which I think one has to put in quotes, because if you don't, it undermines the entire academic enterprise of the pursuit of knowledge as a good. Yeah. Yes, I partly welcome the shift towards impact, because as a policy researcher working on soft money, trying to get in enough grants to keep my institute afloat and to keep people in work, it's a boon to have government saying you must be demonstrably valuable to organisations and institutions. But it also feels a bit like it's challenging the heart of the academic enterprise. But anyway, as I'm moving to retirement, I don't have to worry for myself, and I hope that shift will help my research centre carry on getting getting money in and putting useful work out.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you have misgivings about
Impact? Yeah, absolutely. Exactly the way that you've just said. In some respects, it's very useful, and why wouldn't you want to have impact and change the world in some small way? But on the other hand, if an academic enterprise become dominated, that seems like you close down options and possibilities on the production of knowledge. I mean, so obviously, European criminology has grown, and there's more money because it's sending more people to this conference to come here, and all the expense involved. And do you see this kind of pattern elsewhere in Europe, or do our European colleagues have a different set of priorities?
I was talking to French, German and other colleagues last night, in fact, and no other country seems to have embraced an impact agenda as clearly as UK, but they're all sort of moving in that direction. And I would have thought that it's a trajectory that will happen across Europe, I suspect, with all the misgivings that we obviously share about that.
Yeah. I mean, how would you characterise? I mean, one of the things that has always struck me is the ease of which we start fitting national stereotypes to the way that criminologists from different countries operate, or academics from different countries operate. But would you say there is a fundamental distinction between British, French and German academia, and specifically in the way that criminology is done in those three major European countries?
Actually, I mean, just going back to the panel that we were both at this morning, where there were British, French and German people presenting, all speaking the same language, both methodologically and linguistically, I thought we had a pretty shared approach to the issues that we were looking at. Now, it could be that that's atypical, but I didn't feel like I was in a room full of intellectual strangers. What has been disappointing and puzzling is that some of the trivial national stereotypes seem to hold up when you do international comparative research. Like the Southern Europeans are always late and they've forgotten their latest jacket, and the Northern countries are always on time and wondering why the Southern European ones are late, and so on. But that is trivial. I think intellectually there's a convergence, at least I hope so.
And presumably forums such as this conference are part of that process.
Yes,
some kind of convergence. Yes. So if we moved on to our kind of crystal ball gazing efforts, what do you think are the main challenges for our object of study in the coming years? What's going to, if you had a crystal ball and you were looking inside it, what would you think is going to be? What we're going to be talking about in 5 or 10 years' time?
That's quite difficult. My crystal ball is rather opaque and doesn't tell me very much. You've got to identify what the key futurology trends are, and the gloomy picture is that the distance between academic criminology and practice in the criminal justice system continues to be attenuated, and eventually criminology gets found out as a completely disengaged discipline and loses its currently quite buoyant standing within universities and contracts, and policy issues will then be the analysis that helps support policy will be entirely in-house to justice organisations and government departments. I don't like the sound of that future at all, but it may well happen. When I was president of the British Society of Criminology from 2008 to 2011, my sort of platform was to try and bring back the sense of shared enterprise between academics and government, and I really don't feel I made very much difference at all. It may have helped stop the rate of change, the rate of growth of gap, but I don't think we really did a lot to make new friends of government. across the discipline. But as I say, things like the graduate entry requirements for policing could create quite a large volume of very applied teaching courses that keep criminology alive. What do you think? Have you got a sharper crystal ball than I have?
No, I mean the two questions I've had there. One is a kind of institutional question. One is a practical question. And institutionally, you've talked a lot about the kind of the distance between large parts of academic criminology and policymakers and government. And you've kind of given some hints about why you think that distance there. But I wonder if you could expand on it, because that seems to be quite an important theme. And what is it that's creating this? And I agree. There are significant sections of British and European academic criminology that doesn't have any kind of conversation really with government, or even with particular criminal justice institutions. There are obviously there are some that does, but why is this kind of what's happened?
I think the key driver is probably the increasingly populist nature of government that has made civil servants and the ministers who direct them much more anxious about any uncontrolled statements about their work. So when I started work in the Home Office in the 70s, we quite regularly briefed journalists on what we did and had sort of open communication channels with key Home Affairs journalists as a matter of course. This would totally freak out the press office of government departments now. They'd be horrified at the idea that their fairly junior researchers were chatting away with the Home Affairs people of the day. The big change was in the early 90s when the then Conservative administration just took a tight grip of publication. And I think that froze relationships between academia and government. And an added factor was the way that the topic expertise of senior civil servants was eroded, where civil servants, rather than people who knew a lot about justice and had a deep understanding of the justice system and its values, became program managers who went from subject to subject, government department to government department, and didn't have a real a rich grasp of what the institutions were that they were trying to affect. So that was the freezing bit. The thawing bit, of course, is partly money. And the thing I forgot to mention is that the Home Office has invested quite a lot in police academic partnerships. That I don't know if UCL is involved. I don't think you are. Yeah, but a lot of academic centres are getting quite a lot of money to work with the police in generating local research. That's possibly if the Home Office continues to fund that sort of activity, that could counteract the freezing of relations and lead to a thaw. It's very difficult to judge how it's going to go.
I mean, I guess the kind of let's say radical critique of this argument would be that criminologists shouldn't be in the service of government and should be precisely making a critique of the actions of government, which you necessarily probably have to do from the outside. And I certainly don't think that we would want to move to a situation characterising very broadly, like as it is in the United States, where people are primarily working around very narrowly focused crime prevention, reduction kinds of subjects. So that seems to me that there's probably some middle ground between the UK and the US. Do you see that in any other countries in Europe? Anywhere that's getting it right?
No, I don't know enough about the quality of relationship that individual researchers have with relevant policy folk. But I think that I know what the trick to turn is, which is to somehow manage to be a genuine critical friend, both critical and friend, and find ways of saying challenging things in acceptable ways. And that means academics who want to affect policy for the better have got to make compromises, but have got to avoid being compromised. So it's got quite a difficult tightrope to walk. Mm. And I'd be truly troubled if the tendency in UK criminology to focus on access or trade, focus on impact, where funding was dependent on impact. If that killed off critical criminology, that would obviously be the very bad a turn for the worse. Mm. So I have a notion of quite substantial engagement with policy as a critical friend who can actually say difficult things, and probably there needs to be a wing of criminology that is vigorously critical. But if the gap between policy and criminology grows, I think it will be bad news for the discipline as a whole.
And my other question, just that came to mind when you were talking, relates to our kind of core object of interest, which is crime, and also your experience of working on the British Crime Survey, etc. And the current moment, we've had a 20-year reduction in most forms of crime, we think. That seems to be maybe changing in the UK and possibly elsewhere as well. So my kind of questions there would be, do you think that's right? Do you think the reduction in crime has ended? And if it has, why do you think that is?
If you'd asked me that a year ago, I would have said that the anomalous trend was the rising crime from the 50s to the mid-90s in England, a little bit earlier in the States, and slightly different timings elsewhere, but basically there was an anomalous rise, and what we're seeing now is a return to the fall that has been over centuries. I now have some more doubts about that, as it seems that lots of forms of high harm violence in the UK are kicking up a little bit. My current view on what's driving trends is that the rise up until the mid-90s was anomalous, that we have pressures that are over the very long run driving down, civilizing us, and pushing down crime, and that there may be some countervailing trends within subgroups. So obviously young, marginalised people, often from minority ethnic backgrounds in big cities facing social exclusion, face serious problems about crime, knife crime, gang crime, which are going against the overall trend. Whether that is a blip that's then turned back into the overall downward trend again, I really don't know, and I hope it does. What's your take on that? Is this a blip, or is it another turning point?
I think it's a blip for what it's worth. I mean, I buy your argument that crime fell over the longue durée for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then there was this anomalous upward trend for 30 years, and it would seem bizarre to me to imagine, given the current economic and social and political climate, that's going to go into serious reverse. But of course that doesn't, again, as you quite rightly say, that doesn't mean in particular areas, among particular social groups, in particular contexts, there aren't going to be increases in crime, often quite serious increases in crime. But they seem to me to be anomalies again, rather than general.
Oh, I'm glad we agree on that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you agree also that what we were bad at as a discipline was our complete failure to anticipate the reverse in crime, and it took some time before we got a decent set of explanations for crime drops.
Yeah.
So we could be wrong-footed. I mean, we were wrong-footed. we might be wrong-footed again.
I mean, in terms of the policy response to crime, I mean, that just to almost finish on this, in terms of the policy response to crime, I think that's a very interesting question, because if we think about issues of popular punitivity and etc., which found some kind of expression over a period where crime was declining. So what is going to happen if it really does start increasing in a very significant way in terms of the policy response to that increase?
Yes. A crime increase, an upturn in crime that was coupled with a worsening political environment that supported tough, no-nonsense, firm interventions that particularly bit on outgroups rather than the majority of the population. One could have a very toxic situation that would not help create the sort of society that I want to live in.
I think we can always close out. Actually, my one last thing I wanted to do is the kind of question you always have at the end of a PhD viva, which is there anything you'd like to say which we haven't discussed in the last 50 minutes?
Dear me, there must be lots. No, I think that's probably quite enough to have said.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, Mike. Thanks for talking, and have a good rest of the conference.
And you. Thanks.